I'd like to tell you a story about a business that had 94 competitors within it, all vying for a similar audience in different locations, all within the same marketplace. And almost none of them make a profit. And I want to ask you the question, should the 94 businesses competing in that space, that none of them effectively make any money, think about doing things a little different? So a couple of things have been popping up in my feed, and some conversations have led me to ask some interesting questions of myself. So I tapped into ChatGPT. How many of the clubs that compete in the professional leagues in the UK are profitable at an operating basis, i.e. before player trading? And there were a couple of interesting things that came out of that because, one, don't always trust what AI throws out. So it said that all the Premier League clubs were profitable at an operating basis, which is, as we know, not true. And anyone who subscribes to Swiss Ramble like myself will understand that that is statistically definitely not true. In fact, the vast majority of them are not. But then the research also showed, and I assume that this is probably inaccurate to a certain point, it said that none of the clubs in the Championship and none of the clubs in League One or Two were profitable on an operating basis. And it quoted sources like The Guardian and Deloitte and others. And it's going to be, give or take, there's going to be at least 10%, hopefully, in that, maybe 9 clubs out of 94, maybe 10 will be profitable. But again, I ask you the question, is that something that is sustainable, should be continued, or indeed should be changed, and changed potentially quite radically? And the reason this has come to mind are two things got brought to me. One was speaking to somebody who's owned sports teams. And they said, look, if you look around the world, sports leagues and the teams within those leagues tend to be profitable and tend to be successful when there is a cap on the wages. And the cap is generally around 50 to 55% of income into the league, right? All of the income that comes into the league, roughly 50, 55%. No more than that is shared with the athletes. The athletes do well. The clubs are sustainable. The franchises, if you want to think of them as that, depending on where you're from, are profitable or at least break even. And again, you can then point to something like Formula One, where most people told me in 2020 when I said you should look at Formula One teams that this was a black pit of losses. But since they put in a cost cap, which doesn't cover everything, and there are ways to exploit holes in it, so it needs to be tightened, in my personal opinion. But most of the teams are now profitable or have sight of profitability and understand, at the very least, what their losses will be. So I've been looking around, and I would have to say I agree that, generally speaking, if your costs are capped of wages from the league, not just from a club, but from the league, 50, 55%, it's profitable and sustainable. Then you go to questions like the fan-led review and what do we need to do, and that is leading to a regulator. And the question for me is, well, what actually should be the primary goal of the regulator? Because my argument would be that keeping British football and football in general operating on the same model that it's operated historically, and certainly since 1992 when it turned professional in the UK in real terms, in terms of the Premier League, and then the EFL and so on. Yeah, I'm not sure that keeping it the same way is working if, according to the sources that ChatGPT found, not a single club runs an operating profit. So if the fan-led review and regulator want to sustain that business model, that in itself is unsustainable. You basically have to only enable investors who can come in who are willing to lose money, which has been the way of old. And that, to me, it's not about not wanting ambition. It's about wanting our sports to be here in the future. So it's a very difficult thing to ask. It's a very difficult thing to look for the answers for. And I think there are better ways of running sports businesses. I think there's better ways of making money. Underlying it, if you continue to look at a business model that says we will always lose money because we always have lost money, that to me needs people to shake the tree. It just does. The last bit was that, I remember going to the unofficial partner billion-dollar question on what would you do with women's football several years ago. It was a wonderful thing to participate in. And afterwards at drinks, several ladies said to me, and I heard in conversation, that they wanted to replicate the men's structure. And I begged them to do something different. It's like, you've got to, when you look at a league, and I was assuming that I wasn't doing the research, but I was assuming, and unfortunately my assumptions apparently are quite accurate on this one. Why would you want to replicate something when all your clubs are bankrupt? They all lose money, they're all loss-making, they're all illiquid effectively, technically. Why would you want to replicate that? Now, I think there is a better way to build women's football. That's why I'm an investor in the space. That's why I'm attached to Mercury 13 and what they're trying to do. I believe there is a better way, and I believe there's good upside. But some of these difficult questions have to be asked, because if they're not, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not sustainable.